Hello and welcome back to Radical Engagements. And I like to find articles that actually explain certain positions that Marxists have, or Marx had, or Engels had that are seemingly paradoxical. I've already covered their stance on immigration, where they admitted that immigration was actually a negative pressure on some of the downward streams of the proletariat. Still should be vaguely reported because of its internationalist character and the fact that picking either side in the immigration debates help one side of capital versus another. In short, yes, immigration is abused by capitalists, but so is protectionism, and so is anti-immigration sentiments. And most socialists who try to support anti-immigration sentiments in Marx either have to do so in countries trying to transition in one country to socialism, which is not what Marx is talking about, or having to do so off of an idea that Marx thought that Irish labor was bad for British labor without finishing reading the rest of the article, which actually implies that there's a lot more going on there. Now, I also think, abolishing borders when you're in capitalism is also a fool's errand. So, you don't hear me talking about immediate abolition of borders, but nonetheless. So that's a seemingly paradoxical position that I found a good article from the monthly review that covered the evidence for what we know about it. And likewise, I found an article by Sam Badger. I've done one piece by Badger. He's a patron of mine, actually, and I interact with him on a regular basis, so know that I have some bias here, that points out what Marx and Engels said about protectionism and free trade. So let's get straight to it. You can find this on Sam's Substack. And as always, I will link all this stuff in the show notes. What did Marx and Engels think on protectionism and free trade? Long. It actually isn't that long, buddy, but it's not short. When America's ruling class is at war with itself over two increasingly stark positions on trade, we can turn to the 19th century debates on the same issue. This is a rather long article. I may try to abridge it and publish it later this week if I can find the time. Don't worry, don't do that. Keep it long. I can still probably read it in less than an hour, so you're fine. On April 2nd, the day after April Fool's Day, the American president walked into a podium with a giant placard. On this placard was a list of countries with their upcoming tariffs. The tariffs were framed as reciprocal ones levied against countries that had tariffs on goods from the United States. Yet it was almost immediately came out that some of these countries were listed were barely inhabited or even uninhabited islands, nor were the tariffs attributed to each country on the U.S. goods remotely accurate, whether the administration calculated the tariffs each country had on the United States from its trade deficit. Ugh. Trump's tariffs have been giving a number of conflicting pretexts. And, now that we've seen them be dropped dramatically, but they're still around. I'm saying this on the 15th of May, and this was probably written in early April. This will probably come out in June, so who knows? They might all be back by that time. Right now, China is on a 10% tariff baseline, and then an additional 20% tariff for fentanyl, whatever. And then that's it. Down from the 150 something tariff that was probably going to destroy the entire economy of the entire world if it continued. But things are still looking to be going to be interesting in this. A couple months earlier, he had presented tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods, pissing off Fortress North America. And he explained that these tariffs one moment as a response to fentanyl smuggling and in the next moment as a move to transition to production back to the United States, although he did no investment to make that happen, nor its infrastructure being invested in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He basically tried to do neoliberalism in one country. So, fun. Likewise, he justified the April tariff both as a method to bring production back to the United States and as an attempt to bring in more revenue and maybe even to replace income tax. And I say this because there's going to be a lot of Marxists who's like, we're in a new era and old Marxist economics don't apply. They don't understand Marxist economics anyway. You should ignore them. Let's go into this. These are the reciprocal tariff charts. I'm not going to go through it all because they've already changed, but this is what was released on Liberation Day. I say in quotation marks for those listening. Those tariffs have spawned a remarkable political debate. Much of the business class is deeply troubled as they see tariffs as a direct attack on their profitability, particularly if they're petit bourgeois they are. Many of the middle class and working class Americans likewise see tariffs as a serious inflationary risk as the goods they depend on shoot up nearly 50% or more, such as the goods that we come from Vietnam, which are now facing a tariff of 46%. Yet Some working class Americans from parts of the country that have been ravaged by 4 decades of deindustrialization see Chuck's tariffs threat as a potential savior from the ravages of free trade, even though they don't seem to understand how much automation goes into a modern factory, and that we're down to like 15% of mid-century employment capacity in a factory now. I mean, down to 15% of that now. Even Sean Fain, the otherwise liberal leader of the United Auto Workers Union, has given some support to them, speaking out of both ends of his mouth, kind of. The problems with how these tariffs were calculated have been discussed in detail. Since it was calculated from the trade deficit, tiny Lesotho was hit with a 50% tariff since they are too poor to import goods from the United States. Trump justified this by arguing that countries like Lesotho were ripping off American workers. Lesotho's impoverished textile workers might be confused as to how this is the case. Perhaps the American government would do better to look at American multinationals who own the factories there. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels on tariffs. Like so many things, wherever there's a serious economic debate, especially one that has been framed in class terms, I turn to the writings of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels on similar issues in their own epoch. Marx and Engels lived in a time where the debate between free trade and protectionism was one of the defining controversies. When they moved to England in the late 1840s, England had recently abandoned its controversial corn tariff, the Corn Laws, and moved further towards free trade. Meanwhile, America, Germany, and France were adopting protectionist policies to help catch up to England's rapidly growing industry, which I actually think early in industrial development, tariffs actually make sense from a capitalist perspective. But I'm not going to go off on that right now. We're not in the early phases of industrial development here in America. We're the second largest producer in the world, and most of what we bring back in terms of production wouldn't employ that many people. So, yeah. But anyway, as Marx and Engels saw the issue, it is primarily a question of development of the means of production. The most advanced an industrial economy is, the more it benefits from free trade because it can attain the resources it needs from across the world while finding markets for surplus from its vast industrial machine. England desperately needed cotton for its massive textile industry, and it needed a market for its jackets, trousers, and shirts. And they really liked slave textiles until the Civil War, and then they expanded the Raj. So I'm not going to go too much into that. Conversely, developing economies hoping to build a textile industry of their own need barriers on imports of English textiles, lest their burning business get crushed by British rivals. Marx and Engels documented those positions and their rationales and gave their thoughts on how the nascent working class movement ought to approach these policies. Marx and the Corn Laws. We can begin with a speech which Marx delivered in 1848 on the English Corn Laws. The Corn Laws were tariffs on grain imports from other countries. They have been advocated by the followers of Thomas Malthus in England. You will really see that a whole lot of Marx is hating on Malthus, who were concerned with the English food sovereignty. The central concern of the Malthusian school was overpopulation, and cheap food imports would reduce domestic food production, increase the local population, and make the country dependent on food imports to starve off famine. Lord forbid England ever lose its navy in a war and face a blockade. Yet Malthusian justification was a secondary to the material interests of the aristocratic rural landlords who dominated the English conservative politics. For these rural landlords, high food prices meant that the farms were more profitable and they could charge more rent from the farmers. Even the land that was less fertile could turn a profit, as these farms would otherwise be unprofitable with foreign competition could turn a profit. Against the Corn Laws, an alliance of workers and capitalists organized a movement for free trade. This movement was inspired by the Ricardian School of Economics. David Ricardo, the preeminent English economist of the 19th century, complemented Adam Smith's theory of market exchange with the notion of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage held that every nation produced certain goods more efficiently than others, and each region and nation would profit the most being able to produce what they specialized in and trade with others. Tariffs, according to the Ricardian school, undermine the efficiency of the economy by protecting less efficient industries in the countries with tariffs. Without the Corn Laws, the English consumer could buy cheaper grain from other countries that made it more efficiently. The industrial capitalists in English argued that the Corn Laws only profited the snoopy old English aristocrats with their fancy titles and ridiculous estate houses. The only cost of eliminating the Corn Laws was reducing the rent the aristocrats received, and that was no real loss. With the Corn Laws gone, England's burgeoning urban working class could buy cheap grain from France, America, Holland, and other food exporters. The English working class recognized that and organized behind the efforts to reduce those duties. Yet English workers were cynical about their industrialist allies. There were the same factory owners who had resisted working class demands to reduce the legal limit of the working day to 10 hours. 10 hours. 10 hours. All right. Those were no fools. As Marx explains, these capitalists did not have their best interest at heart. Long quote from Marx. Besides, how could the working man understand the sudden philanthropy of the manufacturers, the very men still busy fighting against the 10-hour bill, which was to reduce the working day of the mill hands from 12 to 10? To give you an idea of the philanthropy of these manufacturers, I would remind you, gentlemen, that the factory regulations enforce on all the mills. Every manufacturer has for his own private use a regular penal code in which fines are laid down for every voluntary and involuntary offense. For instance, a worker pays so much of if he has a misfortune to sit down on a chair, if he whispers or speaks or laughs, if he arrives a few moments too late, or if any part of the machine breaks, or he does not turn out work of quality desired, etc., etc. The fines are greater than the damage really done by the worker, and to give the worker every opportunity for incurring fines, the factory clock is set forward. He is not given a bad raw material to make into good pieces of stuff. An overseer not sufficiently skillful manipulating in cases of infractions our rules is discharged. As Marx makes pains to argue, and as many of the workers fighting for free trade knew full well, once bread was cheaper, the industrialists could endeavor to reduce the wages of the workers. The capitalists wanted to pay the working class as little as possible, and cheaper food meant they could survive off less. And this, in turn, meant more profits for the industrialists. The English workers have very well understood the significance of the struggle between the landlords and the industrial capitalists. They know very well that the price of bread was to be reduced in order to reduce wages, and that the industrial profit would rise as much as the rents fell. And do not believe, gentlemen, that this is a matter of indifference of the worker to whether or not he receives 4 francs on the account of the corn being cheaper when he had been receiving 5 francs before. So why then had the workers allied with the industrialists if they knew that cheap bread just meant lower wages? For one thing, it allowed the workers to play, divide, and rule against the ruling class. Eventually, the landed aristocrats, resentful of the upstart industrial capitalists, would side with the workers to push for regulations on the length of the working day. The English workers have made their English free traders realize that they are not the dupes of their illusions or their lies. If, in spite of this, the worker made the common cause with them against the landlords, for it was the purpose of destroying the last remnants of feudalism, and in order to only have one enemy left to deal with. The workers have not miscalculated, for the landlords, in order to revenge themselves upon the manufacturers, made common cause with the workers to carry the 10 hours bill, which later had been vainly demanded for 30 years, and which passed immediately after the repeal of the Corn Laws. Oops. That's in the text. So out of the deal, the workers got cheaper food and a reduction to the working day, even if the industrialists opportunistically cut wages once food was cheaper. At least the workers had a bit more free time to be with their families, educate themselves, and organize, or at least sleep a bit longer and rest their weary bones. Yet the most important impact of free trade, Marx argues, is increasing the speed at which industry develops. This would be no surprise, as we saw it was the industrial capitalists of England who supported free trade, not the rural landowners. Industry became more profitable, which had just increased the flood of capital into industry. Chaotic anarchic growth enabled by free trade had both good and bad effects for the workers. With free trade, the material that drives industry floods them more cheaply. The greater profits drove the development of new technologies in England that reduced the price of consumer goods. Growing industry means more demand for labor, and more demand for labor means higher wages. The whole line of argument amounts to this: free trade increases the productive forces. If industry keeps growing, if wealth is productive power, if, in a word, productive capital increases, the demand for labor, the price of labor, and consequently the rate of labor also arises also. The most favorable condition for the worker is the growth of capital. This must be admitted. If capital means stationary, industry will not remain stationary but will decline. And in this case, the worker will be the first victim. He goes to the wall before the capitalist. And in this case, where the capital keeps growing and the circumstances where we have said are best for the workers, what will be his loss? He will go to the wall just the same. Yet, it has also harmful effects for the workers. Industry machinery made their skills less relevant. And oh my God, do we see that now? Skilled workers become less and less skilled and reduce their bargaining power, allowing capitalists to reduce their wages. It forces them to increasingly compete with their own wives and children, who were able to work many of the jobs that once only men could do. This competition becomes a factor as the division of labor enables a single worker to do the work of three. Machinery accomplishes the same result on a much larger scale. The growth of productive capital, which forces industrial capitalists to work with constantly increasing means, ruins the small industrialists and throws them into the proletariat. Then, at the rate of interest falling into the proportion as capital accumulates, the small rentiers who can no longer live on their dividends are forced to go into industry and thus swell the number of the proletariat. More naturally, the intensified competition of free trade led increasingly to the centralization of capital and the fewer and fewer firms, as most competitive industries bought out less competitive ones and monopolized their trade options. Finally, the more productive capital increases, the more it is compelled to produce for a market whose requirements it does not know. The more production precedes consumption, the more supply tries to force demand. Consumption crises increase in frequency and in intensity, but every crisis in turn hastens the centralization of capital and adds to the proletariat. So what is Marx's verdict on free trade? For one thing, free trade is freedom for capital, not for labor. That's important. That's vital. But that's also true for protectionism. Protectionism is protection for capital, not for labor. Do not be fooled. Just different parts of capital. Anyway, to sum up, what is free trade? What is free trade under the present condition of society? It is the freedom of capital. When you have overthrown a few national barriers which restrict the progress of capital, you will merely be given a complete freedom of action. Gentlemen, do not allow yourself to be deluded by the abstract word freedom. Whose freedom? It is not the freedom of one individual in relation to another, but the freedom of capital to crush the worker. And after all, free trade is not freedom of movement. Capital is free to travel between England, America, France, and England, but not the worker. It creates opportunities for the workers to get cheaper goods, but it does even more to heighten their exploitation, as it disproportionately empowers the industrial capitalists that employ them. Yet Marx makes clear that free trade should still be supported by the working class. This is like the thing on immigration. It's not obvious. Do not imagine, gentlemen, that in criticizing freedom of trade, we have the least intended of defending the system of protection. One may declare oneself an enemy of a constitutional regime without declaring oneself a friend of the ancient regime. By increasing the rapidity of industrial development, free trade increased the growth of the capitalist market economy and created new political opportunities for the working class to collectively better their position. But, and this is a long quote from Marx, in general, the protective system of our day is conservative, whereas free trade system is destructive. It breaks up old nationalities and pushes the antagonism of the proletariat and bourgeoisie to an extreme point. In a word, free trade hastens the social revolution. It is this revolutionary sense alone, gentlemen, that I am in favor of free trade. Thus, Marx supported free trade in industrial England, at least, as a method to empower the working class in the long term, even if in the short term it also empowered their main antagonist, the industrial capitalists who employed them. Engels on free trade. Unfortunately, Marx's analysis remains largely centered in England in the mid-19th century. The debates over free trade and protectionism would expand to France, Germany, America, Russia, and other countries over the course of the 1800s. Here, we can look to Preface Engels, who wrote a pamphlet that consisted of Marx's earlier 1848 speech. Engels broadens the discussion by applying the principles Marx outlined to other cases, as well as the later development in England. Engels summarizes Marx's support for free trade as follows. To him, free trade is a normal condition of modern capitalist production. Only under free trade can immense productive forces of steam, electricity, of machinery be full developed. The quicker the pace of this development, the sooner and more fully will be realized its inevitable result. Society splits into two classes, capitalists here, wage laborers there. I don't know if that's really happened, but that was the idea. Hereditary wealth on one side, hereditary poverty on the other, supply outstripping demand, markets being able to absorb even greater massive production of industry, an ever-recurring cycle of prosperity, glut, crisis, panic, chronic depression, gradual revival of trade, the harbinger not of permanent improvement, but of renewed overproduction and crisis. In short, basically the business cycle. In short, the productive forces expand to such a degree that they rebel against unbearable feathers, against the social institutions in which they put in motion. The only possible solution, a social revolution, freeing the social productive forces from the feathers of antiquated social order and the actual producers, the great mass of the people, from wage slavery. And because free trade is a natural, normal atmosphere for this historical evolution, the economic minimum in which the conditions are for inevitable social revolution will be the students created. And for this reason and this reason alone, did Marx declare in favor of free trade. Yet economic history kept moving. As Marx was developing his speech, a gold rush was occurring in California, which dumped gold into the market, which would be followed by another similar rush in Australia. The gold would create more money circulating around the market, because we haven't moved the fiat currency yet, facilitating more trade. Railroads and steamships reduced logistic costs, making trade physically easier as well. Unfortunately for England, the English industrialists faced protectionism in their main trading partner. Though their opium war had opened up China, the largest market in the world, to unfettered trade, France, Germany, Russia, and America all imposed tariffs on English goods. They needed to do so because their industries were still small and simply could not compete with the industrial might of Victorian England. That's funny. They don't have that industrial might anymore. Those protective tariffs allowed the growth of industry in other countries, and whose free trade helped England to grow. From the less developed countries, it was protectionism that ensured their industrialization. Protection, being the means of artificial manufacturing manufacturers, may therefore appear useful not only to an incomplete developed capitalist class still struggling with feudalism, but also may give life to a rising capitalist class of the country, which, like America, has never known feudalism, but which has arrived at a stage of development where the passage from agriculture to manufacturers becomes a necessity. America placed in this situation and decided in favor of protection until it didn't. I added that last part, but that's Engels. Yet protection in this respect functioned as a ladder that quickly turned into a feather. As more countries industrialized, the more it needed free trade to grow in its other industries. Bingo. This is why when you do protectionism in your course of development really matters. And honestly, Marx doesn't differ from like classical economists on this. Protectionism is at best an endless screw. You never know when you have done with it. By protecting one industry, you directly or indirectly hurt all others, and therefore to protect them too. And by doing so, you again damage the industry that you first protected and have to compensate it. And this compensation reacts, as before, on all other trade and entitles them to redress, and so ad infinitum. We see this in like Trump's having to bail out farmers all the time, and both his first and now second administrations. All right. This in turn generates political squabbles as intrigues, as industries grow to lobby themselves protected and reduce tariffs on goods that they need. American factories were lobbied to remove tariffs on coal, for instance, while the coal miners in America lobbied to increase tariffs on coal while reducing tariffs on pickaxes. Engels argued that this exacerbates all the dirty dealing and intrigue which characterize the legislatures of capitalist society, a process which presumably is occurring right now in America, as various industries calling the White House to reduce tariffs whenever it fits the needs of its own sector, which empowers the executive branch, by the way, which is part of why the executive branch likes it. Protectionism allows an industry to keep growing free from competition until it has met the demands of its own national market. And once the industry has met the demand of its own domestic market, it requires free trade to continue growing. Otherwise, you stagnate. And stagnation in capitalism is death. You can stagnate under socialism, and that might even be a good thing. Once you have to protect the forces, you can reduce the labor day, etc. But you can't do that in a capitalist society. It doesn't work. The moment a branch of national industry has become completely conquered the home market, the moment exportation becomes a necessity to it. Under capitalist conditions, an industry either expands or it wanes. A trade cannot remain stationary. Stoppage of expansion is an incipient ruin. The progress of mechanical and chemical invention, by constantly superseding human labor, even more rapidly increasing and concentrating capital, creates an ever stagnant industry at the glut of both workers and of capital, a glut which finds no vent everywhere, and because the same process is taking place in all other industries. Engels details this process played out in different countries. 1. Germany. Engels recounts how Germany developed rapidly under protective duties implemented by their imperial government. Yet in the late 1860s, events conspired to motivate them to increase tariffs to the point they ought to be decreasing it. An influx of American corn was reducing the profitability of German farmers, thereby reducing the rents paid to the aristocratic landlords. German industrialists likewise faced an increased competition from English industrialists hoping to offload excess production cheaply into the continent. Therefore, the German middle class imposed high tariffs, which simply ground German consumers into deeper poverty. This high protectionism caused waves in the German economy, which was also driving immigration to places like America and to France. Engels recounted how France likewise was suffering under excess industrial protectionism. Where England specialized in cheap consumer goods, France specialized in luxuries. French craftsmen in luxury goods could not be beaten, but as Engels explains that the foreign nouveau riche were tempted to just buy cheaper imitations from England and Germany. Ouch. We see this is a forever cycle kind of thing. In light of this, many inefficient French industries chugged along without any real competition, and thus any incentive to implement innovation and efficient forms of automation. Only free trade could awaken the French industry from its slumber and instigate further industrial development. 3. Russia. The Russian case is a particularly interesting one, as Russia demanded high tariffs that could be paid only in gold. The Russian government saw tariffs both as a means to raise government revenue, but also as a way to protect the tiny Russian industrial base, as Russia was still largely underdeveloped. Yet the tariffs in this respect served a contrary purposes, as any industrialization would therefore reduce the revenue which the Russian state depended on. That sounds similar because we're in a similar paradox right now. As Engels explained, on the very day on which the tariff fulfills its protective mission by totally excluding foreign goods, on that day the Russian government is bankrupt. Ultimately, the Russians sought to create an autarkic economy totally independent from global trade, a view which Engels was intensely dismissive of. Long quote. And yet the same government amuses itself by dangling before their eyes the prospect of making Russia, by means of this tariff, an entirely self-supplying country, requiring from the foreigner neither food, nor raw material, nor manufactured articles, nor works of art. The people who believe in this vision of a Russian empire, secluded and isolated from the rest of the world, are on a level with the patriotic Prussian lieutenant who went into a shop and asked for a globe, not a terrestrial or celestial one, but a globe of Prussia. 4. America. The American case is also interesting, as tariffs allowed large trusts like Standard Oil to emerge free from competition from English oil. These tariffs complemented the natural advantages of America's geology and ecology. Yet, other tariff-protected sugar monopolies that only hurt the American consumer by denying the competitive pricing of consumer goods. As Engels argues, these 4 cases show the role protection plays in enabling local industrialization, but they also hurt the consumer just as much as English corn laws did. This is because protections were no longer benefiting nascent industries that could not compete with the English industry, but large monopolistic trusts, which is very much where we're at now. I just want to point that out there. Engels points to how even the famed English textile mills were increasingly tempted by trade protections, although a slim majority continued to support free trade. This wasn't because they needed the protection, only because it allowed them to rip off the consumers more easily. As Engels explained, the English industrialists conveniently used the pretext of reciprocal tariffs against the American, French, German, and Russian markets that tariff their goods. Quote, it was to stave off the impending fate that protection, scarcely disguised under the veil of fair trade and retaliatory tariffs, is now invoked by such fervor by the sons of the very men who, 40 years ago, knew no salvation but in free trade. And when English manufacturers began to find the free trade is ruining them and asked the government to protect them against their foreign competition, then surely the moment has come for their competitors to retaliate by throwing overboard a protective system henceforth useless to fight the fading industrial monopoly of England with its own weapon, free trade. Engels concludes in his preface by returning to the fact that you can easily introduce protection, but you cannot easily get rid of it, or not get rid of it so easily. As he explains, the legislature, by adopting the protective plan, has created vast interests for which it is responsible. And not every one of these interests, the various branches of industry, is equally ready at a given moment to face competition. Some will be lagging behind, others no longer have the need for protection for protective nursing. This difference of position will give rise to a usual lobby plotting, and in itself a sure guarantee of the protected industries this free trade is resolved upon will be let down the very easy indeed as the silk manufacturers in England after 1846. That is unavoidable under present circumstances and will have to be submitted to by the free trade party so long as the change is resolved upon in principle. Engels argues that free trade is ultimately more progressive than enabling the more rapid development of the market economy beyond a certain level of production. On the other hand, protectionism still creates opportunities for socialists because it's a plan for artificially manufacturing manufacturers and therefore also a plan for artificially manufacturing wage laborers. Either way, the economic policy creates opportunities in the long term for the working class to organize, improve their conditions, and eventually replace the capitalist system with one of their own design. The difference is that free trade speeds up the process by increasing the rate of development and the overall dynamism of the capitalist economy. What ought we take from all this? Yeah, what are we to take from all this? I mean, I agree with this all so far, that this is what's implied in Marx, and kind of what, I mean, like, I tend to be like, tariffs are good in early stages of industrial development and bad later on because they protect corrupt monopolies and make the executive branch more powerful, which often is at the expense of general society, blah, blah, blah. So, there we are. What we can learn from Marx and Engels on this depends, first, on whether or not one agrees with their end goal. If, as they argue, if one is looking at it from the end goal of socialism, free trade is generally good because it's a certain kind of industrial development required to transition from capitalism to socialism. Yet protectionism may be necessary for underdeveloped economies. They can also think socialism can come about whether or not we have protectionism in the short term. Thus, Marx called out for free trade, but only tentatively, and Engels goes even further by stating socialists need to not care one way or the other. Which is kind of my point. I mean, I do think tariffs are destructive, but I also tend to think this is an inter-bourgeois fight. On the other hand, if one is liberal, clearly their argument for free trade are decisive. If your goal is for a developed and efficient and free economy, then free trade should be implemented to allow for the smoothest possible movement of capital and goods. In this way, Marx and Engels would agree with free traders that free trade is healthier for capitalism. Those who want protections to reverse deindustrialization of the U.S. economy might appeal to their arguments about the positive role of protectionism for developing economies. Yeah, but we're not a developing economy. As Sam's about to say. Yet there are important differences between the economy that isn't yet industrialized and the economy that is deindustrialized. Very important differences, and we'll get to them. The developing economy needs capital to finance industry, and it needs to protect its industry from foreign competition that would squash it like a bug. Thus, it needs to protect its industries to give them the space to develop. Yet modern Western economies already had tons of capital in the forms of financial assets, even if they have less industrial capital. To rebuild their industry, they just need to push their investment into industry. The problem with tariffs is that the industrial machinery they need for the factories will also be tariffed. So if you want to build a car in a factory in Ohio, you will need to buy robots, steel, and cement from China or from India or from Taiwan or somewhere to get the factory off the ground. And these tariffs will only make that more expensive. So the only way you can fix that is usually government subsidies, and that has its own problem. It is important to keep one caveat in mind. The kinds of protections that Marx and Engels were criticizing were quite different from the sky-high tariffs imposed on America's trading partners. With tariffs at the 50% higher than on many economies, the economic constraints imposed by these tariffs are much more extreme. In addition, goods cross borders much more than they did a century and a half ago, so they have highlighted how many times car parts cross in and out of the United States. They get tariffed each time. And in addition, developing states lack much of the way of the consumer markets, meaning their citizens won't be losing much due to the tariffs. America is different that it already has a large consumer economy, and many of its people work in retail, logistics, and services that will make the consumer economy hum, and that will all break down. And that's not even dealing with the extent of automation, because we are still the second largest industrial producer on the planet, as well as being deindustrialized, because you increasingly have things like black factories and silent factories. Black factories means that they don't need lights. And that's because like factories can be run by like 4 workers and a robot. What I was saying now is like if we look at peak industrial capacity and employment and peak industrial capacity in the 1950s, a modern factory will need 15% of that capacity of workers to work now. Yeah, it's not going to work. There are also differences between our current economic system and the America of the 1800s. Today, the U.S. dollar is the reserve country of the world. Many countries like China and India use the dollar to trade between one another. Additionally, their debt is often valued in dollars, meaning the way they pay off their debts, they need dollars. This dynamic is in no small part responsible for the kinds of trade deficit the U.S. sees. Trade deficits with the U.S. are important for countries like China to have the dollars they need to buy from other economies or to pay them off in their own debt. This demand for dollars that keeps the dollar so strong and what makes it so easy for the U.S. to import goods by simply printing more money. Not conditions which Marx were wrote about, because no currency was strong enough to do that. No currency was strong enough to do that because no state was strong enough to do that in the time Marx was living. It is fair to say that the global economic condition in the U.S. prior to Trump's tariffs was unsustainable. Americans are increasingly drowning in debt, and the deindustrialization of the United States has undermined its economic prospects of the majority of American citizens. But the deindustrialization is not just from getting rid of tariffs, it's from automation. And that has to be dealt with, and I will say Sam isn't talking about it enough in this essay. It's the only oversight I see. Yet Trump is not interested in eliminating the dollar status as a global reserve currency. On the contrary, he's threatened countries that want to move away from the dollar. This is one of the fundamental incoherences and contradictions of his trade policy, one of many fundamental incoherences. Moreover, Engels' warnings on Russia serve as a stark reminder that the U.S. is being deeply foolish in trying to both A, industrialize through tariffs, and B, raise revenue through tariffs. If countries industrialize, it will get less tax revenue for the tariffs. But if it is getting more money from its tariffs, it is only because they have failed to reindustrialize. Thus, the question of a reserve currency and the question of reindustrialization exposes Trump's tariffs as fundamentally contradictory in their purpose. I mean, yeah, duh. It is remarkable that Donald Trump has not noticed this glaring contradiction in his rhetoric and his economic arguments. Or he's just not pointing it out, and he's perfectly aware, and this is about empowering himself. But anyway. Marx and Engels were obsessed with uncovering and attacking those internal contradictions. If they were alive today, they would remark that these aforementioned contradictions. The U.S. wants to use tariffs to raise revenue while pushing reindustrialization. The U.S. wants to maintain its reserve currency status while eliminating its trade deficit. And the U.S. is tariffing the very industrial goods it needs to reindustrialize. No doubt, they would highlight these internal contradictions and warn that Trump's tariffs will inevitably fail. I mean, they already kind of have. At the tasks that the administration has given to them, even if the administration can't believe in all of them, even if it was successful at some of the tasks. That means that it would probably react to a mixture of amusement and irritation that some Marxists are supporting these tariffs as a path to reindustrialization. Yeah, some Marxists don't read Marx very much or don't think through things. Are trying to argue that Trump will have some super secret rationale that justifies them. We know who you're talking about. We know who those people are. We don't. Anyway, they will surely say that tariffs can be good for reindustrialization, but that doesn't mean all are, and that these Marxists are simply abstracting from the particulars of the situation to justify their existing preferences, aka Marx and Engels were first and foremost critics of the economy, which means they are interested in the contradictions instead of projecting some kind of sanity that might well not be present. I'm going to agree with Adam too. A lot of this sane washing is cope for people who have, decided that Bonapartism is their way. Yet they would also criticize the free traders for allowing the U.S. economy to lose its industry in the first place. Had the American system not pushed free trade on the globe quite so aggressively, the American states would not have lost their industrial base. They would have lost a lot of it through automation, Sam, and I think you really do need to look at that. Read Aaron Beniev's work on this. It's pretty important. The industrialization of the third world was a good thing, but it did not come at all at the expense of the deindustrialization of the West. It is foolish to let the West Belt rust into nothing. It is. I agree with you. But even we are still the second largest industrial producer in the world. I don't know what else to point out. I keep pointing that out to people, and they don't know what to make of it. Sometimes we got overtaken by Europe, but their energy policy has made that hard. Although we're not being overtaken by anybody right now. And they would have been warned that such foolish policies would lead to the emergency of an American version of the French Emperor Bonaparte III. I mean, this seems to be like going through Weimar and the results of Weimar at the same time, frankly. Ultimately, Marx and Engels would look upon both factions of the American economic elite with scorn, and they should. Both factions would have wasted the wealth and power of the most prosperous republic in the world history, free traders, by facilitating the loss of American industry. Again, you gotta look at automation here. You really do, Sam. I do think that's the only problem in this essay, but take it seriously. And protectionism by slapping an incoherent sky-high tariffs after the damage has already been done. None of the factions have the interests of the American working class at heart. No shit. And the interests of the working class of the rest of the globe either. No shit. Finally, they would have advised American workers to look to build alliances with workers in other countries instead of depending on free traders or protectionists for emancipation. Cough, 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 cough. The tale of two Seans, cough, cough. The miners in Bolivia, the factory workers in China, the farmers in Mexico, the textile workers in Lisajo are not the enemies of America's working class. On the contrary, they make clothes on our backs, avocados on our toast, and computers that we use to access the internet. Their final advice would be to expand the horizons of our politics away from the stale debates of their own time and towards the new possibilities of global solidarity, which we are rapidly moving away from, even on the left. That is all. Protect your peace. Make of this what you will. But some of these fights where people are like trying to argue that somehow this is revolutionary, and other people are like, oh, it's a doom, we have to become all like Marxio neoliberals now. In some ways, we have to admit that super high tariffs would be very slowing to the American economy, but also free trade is not necessarily going to benefit workers except as consumers, but not as workers. And all these are problems that you have to deal with and are rarely ever dealt with. Good luck and Godspeed. Protect your peace. Oh, I'd like to thank Adriel M for becoming a sponsor level supporter. And I will be doing that soon. If you want more, like and subscribe. There's a Patreon. We start at $4 for all audio. $6 will get you access to audio and video. $10 will get you saying some programming, particularly on the Patreon side. And $15 will get you my unthanking. Will get you a thank you in every episode that comes out for free on the free podcast, and my eternal thanks. You guys have my Patreons. I've had computer problems, and it's actually going to show in some of the production of the shows. The new AI stuff was just overdoing my memory capacity. And thank you, patrons, because you are why I could afford to replace my computer to continue doing this work for you. I really do appreciate it. Thank you all. Have a great day. Protect your peace. Keep sane. Blah, blah, blah. Do well. Do good.